The fluorescent lights hummed their electric monotone above the ICU at Mercy General, that particular hum that never quite stops, not even at 3 in the morning. Katie Morrison moved through the unit with a kind of efficiency that made her invisible. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't slow. She existed in the exact middle space where people stopped seeing you, and that was precisely how she preferred it. Her scrubs were faded, pale blue after 100 washings, the kind of worn that comes from years, not months. The other nurses wore newer ones, brighter ones, the kind that said they had lives outside these walls, lives where they bought new things. Katie's scrub said something different. They said she had learned a long time ago that what mattered wasn't what you looked like on the surface. What mattered was what your hands could do. She was wiping down the cardiac monitor at bed 7 when she heard the first alert tone, not a code, just an admission notification. The charge nurse, Michelle, called out from the station, incoming. Navy Captain Marcus Webb, 43, chest trauma from IED blast in Kandahar province. Hearing loss secondary to blast injury. ETA 8 minutes. Family notification in progress. Katie's hand stopped mid-motion on the monitor screen. Her left hand, the one that sometimes trembled when the automatic doors slammed shut too fast, when trays dropped and clanged in the hallway, when anything sharp and sudden split the air. She steadied it against the cold stainless steel of the monitor frame and kept working. She didn't look up. That was the rule. Look down, work hard, be useful, be quiet. Invisible people got fired less often. Invisible people didn't attract questions about their reference list or why their work history started 8 years ago with a gap so large you could lose a career in it. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it, something that never quite washed away no matter how many times you bleached the floors. It smelled like the thin edge between living and not living, like the particular fear sweat that came off families in the waiting room, like the coffee that sat in the break room pot long enough to separate into layers. Katie finished the monitor at bed 7 and moved to bed 9, where Mr. Chen had been extubated that morning. His vitals were stable now. His daughter had brought him jasmine tea in a thermos yesterday, and the smell had lingered in a way that made the antiseptic seem less absolute. Katie checked his central line with the kind of focused attention most people reserved for diffusing explosives. Her fingers moved with the precision of someone trained for something much worse than this. Someone trained for battlefields and dark extraction zones and the kind of medicine you practiced when there was no hospital for 50 kilometers in any direction. She was writing notes when Dr. Hargrove swept through the unit like he owned it, which technically he did. He was the chief of surgery, and his reputation was built on 3 things: the board of directors, his quarterly metrics, and the fact that everyone around him had learned not to ask questions about how he achieved either of the first 2. Morrison, he said without stopping. Not as a greeting. As a task to be completed. Ensure the new admission has a room prepared. Standard protocol, standard communication methods. I'll need a full vitals assessment within 5 minutes of arrival. Yes, doctor, Katie said quietly. She was already moving. The room was prepped in 4 minutes, 4 pump tested, ventilator on standby, cardiac monitor running, crash cart positioned at the bedside, bed adjusted to the correct height, everything laid out with the efficiency of muscle memory that came from somewhere Katie never discussed. Somewhere that didn't officially exist. She had the beds at both sides of the room stripped and made with fresh sheets when the first siren sound came through the windows. Not a siren exactly, the wail of it carried differently through the heavy glass, muffled and strange, like something from a dream. The ambulance was pulling around the emergency bay entrance. She could hear the radio chatter even from the 4th floor, the particular cadence of medics transferring a critical patient. Coming up, Michelle called out. 3 minutes, people. 2 medics, family arriving separately. Katie took a breath. Just one. The kind that came from training, from knowing that the next few minutes would require every part of her attention to be exactly where it needed to be. The kind of breath that said, I have done harder things than this. I have survived harder things than this. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Captain Marcus Webb was about to walk into her hospital, and Katie Morrison was about to have to pretend she had never seen him before. She had pulled him out of a collapsed building in Ramadi 20 years ago. Had taught him basic sign language while waiting for medevac, because he was 8 years old and deaf and terrified, and the only universal language was the language of hands. Had never imagined he would grow up, never imagined he would become Navy, never imagined he would come back into her life carrying the same kind of wound she carried, the invisible kind that never quite healed. The elevator doors opened at the end of the ICU. 2 paramedics wheeled in a stretcher with controlled urgency. Behind them came a woman with silver-streaked hair and the rigid posture of someone holding themselves together with nothing but will. Behind her came a teenager, maybe 16, with the same dark eyes as the man on the stretcher. And on the stretcher was Captain Marcus Webb, and he was awake. His chest was wrapped with pressure dressings, blood visible at the edges but controlled. His face was grey-white, not from blood loss but from something else, from the particular kind of panic that comes when your body is screaming in pain and your ears are screaming in silence simultaneously. He was trying to speak, trying to reach out, trying to communicate something urgent to the paramedics who couldn't understand what he needed. The paramedics were giving report to Dr. Hargrove, who had appeared like he'd been waiting for an audience. IED blast, secondary fragmentation wound to the left anterior chest, the lead paramedic was saying. Possible pneumothorax. Breath sounds diminished on left side. Blood pressure holding at 98/62, heart rate 127 and climbing. Hearing loss secondary to blast injury, patient is deaf, nonverbal communication only. Captain Webb's hands were moving frantically, trying to sign, but his wife was gripping his arm. Don't move, Marcus, you'll make it worse, she was saying, and his son was staring at him with the kind of helpless terror that only came from being 17 years old and watching your father's life hang by threads you couldn't see. Katie was moving. She hadn't made a conscious decision to move. Her legs had simply carried her around the monitor stands and the 4 pumps to the bedside where they were transferring Webb from the stretcher to the ICU bed. She looked at him. Directly at him. And she saw him see her, really see her, for half a second. That moment where his eyes registered something, some flicker of recognition, some ghost of memory. He was in shock and pain and terrified, but something in his eyes said he knew her from somewhere. Katie raised her hands and signed slowly, clearly, "Where is your pain?" The room went silent. Not the absence of sound, the presence of it, the weight of it, the way silence could be a physical thing pressing down on everyone's head at once. Captain Webb's hands came up immediately, automatic as breathing, and he signed back, chest. Left side. Can't breathe. Can't hear. His wife made a small sound, not quite a gasp, more like something breaking. Marcus, did she just, can she? I know ASL, Katie said quietly, not looking away from Webb. She was already scanning his chest, already assessing the dressings, already moving with the tactical precision that came from training in actual battlefields. Captain, I need you to focus on me. Follow my hands. You're safe now. Tell me about your breathing. Webb's hands moved, rapid, desperate, the sign language of someone who hadn't been able to communicate with another human being since the blast. He was signing faster than he could think, his signs losing their careful grammar and becoming pure emotion, desperate, frightened, alone. Katie's hands moved with him, steady and clear, asking him questions, translating for the paramedics, translating for his family. His left side has sharp pain with each breath, she told the medical team, not looking away from Webb's hands. He says he feels like something's collapsing inside. He can't hear anything in his right ear. His left ear is ringing so loud it's making him nauseous. Webb's wife was leaning forward now, tears streaming down her face. You understand him. You actually understand him. How do you understand him? I worked with deaf patients in the military, Katie said, which was true, just not in any way that mattered. She was already at the foresight, already checking the pressure dressing, already assessing how much blood loss he could tolerate before things became critical. Captain Webb, I'm going to take good care of you. I promise you. You're not alone anymore. And something in those words, in the absolute certainty in them, in the way she signed them so clearly, so precisely, made something in Webb's shoulders drop slightly. Made the panic recede just enough for him to breathe. Dr. Hargrove was watching from the other side of the room. His expression had gone very still. Very calculated. Very dangerous. Katie could feel his eyes on her like a pressure change in the room itself, like when barometric pressure shifts right before a thunderstorm hits. She kept her attention on Captain Webb and his vitals, on the steady work of getting a critical patient stabilized, on doing what she had trained to do. But she could feel Dr. Hargrove's gaze. She could feel him beginning to wonder about the faded scrubs nurse who moved through his ICU like a ghost, who suddenly spoke fluent sign language, whose personnel file was thinner than it had any right to be. She could feel him beginning to question. And that was when everything started to change. Dr. Hargrove entered Captain Webb's room at 1847 hours like a general inspecting a failed battalion. His shoes clicked against the linoleum in a rhythm that made Katie's hand still on the oxygen tubing she was adjusting. Webb's wife stood on one side of the bed, their teenage son on the other, both watching as the chief of surgery positioned himself at the foot of the mattress with the kind of territorial precision that made the small room feel suddenly smaller. "Nurse Morrison, explain to me why you're playing charades instead of following established communication protocols." His voice didn't rise. That was worse than if it had. Low voices were like surgical steel, they cut without the mercy of a scream. Katie straightened, her hands dropping to her sides. The composure came automatically, a muscle memory older than her nursing degree. Measured breath. Still spine. Eyes forward. "Captain Webb is deaf, sir. He was trying to tell us his pain level for the last 40 minutes. Standard assessment required communication." Her voice stayed level, professional, the kind of calm that came from having made harder decisions with better consequences. "I can read a chart, Nurse Nobody." He used the nickname with the precision of someone who'd calculated exactly how much cruelty could fit into 2 words without crossing the line into something actionable. "What I can't read is where in your training manual it says you improvise treatment plans without physician authorization. This isn't a game show." Webb's wife shifted forward. Actually, she helped him tremendously. Hargrove raised one hand, a gesture that silenced the room the way a hand raised at the gates of a fortress stops an entire approaching army. "Mrs. Webb, I assure you your husband is receiving excellent care according to proper medical hierarchy. Some nurses forget that communication flows through physicians, not around us." He turned to face Katie directly now, and his smile was the kind of expression a predator wore. Proper chain of command exists for a reason. When people decide they're above protocol, patient safety suffers. The lie hung in the air like smoke. Katie could have corrected him. She could have pointed to the chart, the declining vitals, the documented attempts to communicate through proper channels that had been dismissed as post-operative anxiety. But that wasn't how this worked. That wasn't how any of this worked. "With respect, Dr. Hargrove, the patient has been trying to tell someone his chest pain is worsening for the past hour." Her voice didn't crack. Her hands didn't tremble. But a single tear escaped down her left cheek, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing he would interpret it as weakness, would use it as ammunition. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with her work, treating the emotion like a spill on a countertop. Something to clean and move past. Nobody was listening. Hargrove's face transformed. The smile faded. His jaw tightened, and for a moment something flickered behind his eyes, the recognition that she hadn't crumbled, hadn't defended herself with anger, hadn't done anything except state a fact. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. "My office. After your shift." He turned and exited, his shoes clicking away down the hallway like a countdown timer. Webb's wife reached over and squeezed Katie's shoulder. Her son looked at the monitor readings, then at Katie's face, with the expression of someone young enough to still believe that doing the right thing protected you. The break room at 11:30 smelled like old coffee and the particular staleness of a space where people spent too many minutes pretending to rest. Katie entered carrying a packed sandwich she'd made at 0:30 that morning, knowing instinctively that today wouldn't offer opportunities for normal breaks. She sat at the corner table, the one nearest the window where the afternoon light turned the Formica surface into something almost bearable to look at. For nurses, Stephanie, Marcus, Jennifer, and the new resident nurse Katie had helped train 3 weeks ago, sat at the main table. They stopped mid-conversation when she sat down. She didn't look up. She opened her sandwich, pretended to be interested in the turkey and wheat bread, and waited. The gathering of bags took 90 seconds. Whispered words she wasn't meant to hear. Did you see the write-up? Hargrove's lost it. I'm not getting involved. The doors swung closed behind them, leaving Katie alone with the refrigerator's rhythmic hum and the fluorescent lights overhead that buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold of pain. She was still chewing the first bite when Hargrove entered. He moved to the coffee maker with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested he'd timed this, planned this, known exactly when she would be alone. The charge nurse, Carol, followed him in. Hargrove had a way of drawing people into his orbit whether they wanted to be there or not. Some people forget their place, Carol. He poured his coffee with theatrical care, steam rising from the cup like smoke from a building after a strike. They think credentials from nowhere make them special. Credentials that don't quite add up, if you dig. He glanced toward the window that connected the break room to the hallway, where 2 staff members were now pausing to listen. I've built this unit's reputation on standards. One person doesn't get to undermine that. Not on my watch. He didn't look at Katie. He didn't need to. The words were shaped like arrows, and she was the only target in the room. Katie kept her eyes on her sandwich, her jaw set so tight she could feel the muscles tremor at her temples. Her hands lay flat on the table, still, demonstrating nothing. She took another bite she didn't taste, swallowed past something tight in her throat that wasn't panic but felt like its cousin. Carol looked between them with the expression of someone trapped on a sinking ship wondering which direction to swim. She left without speaking. Hargrove finished his coffee in 4 swallows and followed her out. The break room door sealed shut with a soft pneumatic hiss. Katie finished her shift without speaking to anyone. She charted Captain Webb's vitals. O2 sat dropping from 97 to 94, respiratory rate climbing from 16 to 20, a trend that made her alarm bells ring like sirens in the language only military medical training teaches you. She flagged it for the night resident. She documented the tracheal deviation she'd noticed that morning, the way his breathing sounded like wind moving through a tunnel that was getting narrower. The day resident dismissed it at morning rounds. 26 years old, top of his med school class, the kind of confidence that came from never having been wrong about something that mattered. Post-op day 2, some discomfort is normal. Vitals trending within acceptable ranges. We'll monitor. Katie didn't argue. She didn't pull the chart across the counter and show him the numbers he should have been reading. She didn't say what her hands already knew, that something was moving wrong in Captain Webb's chest, that the pressure he'd been trying to communicate had a name and a timeline and a consequence if nobody listened. She documented her assessment. She flagged the concern in the chart. She knew, with a particular clarity that comes from 19 years of watching institutional systems eat patient safety for the sake of hierarchy, that it wouldn't matter. When she passed the nursing station later that afternoon, she saw it. The unit board near the central desk, visible to every nurse on rotation, every family member walking past, every physician who needed to know which way the wind was blowing. A formal write-up on hospital letterhead, printed and posted like a warning sign. 3 nurses read it and looked away. One whispered something to another. The family of a post-op patient in room for 12 walked past, saw it, and their expression shifted. Katie stopped for 5 seconds. She read her own humiliation the way you read a diagnosis you already knew was coming. Then she continued to her next patient without a word, because that was the only power she had left, the refusal to let him see that it landed. But at 1,600 hours, when she charted Captain Webb's evening assessment, her hands trembled for the first time. The tremor was small, barely visible, but it was there. Her fingers shook over the keyboard as she documented the downward spiral of a patient nobody was watching because they were all too busy watching her. She pulled up his chart one more time before shift change. O2 sat 91. Respiratory rate 24. Tracheal deviation more pronounced. The clinical picture of something building behind his ribs like pressure in a closed system with nowhere to release. She found the charge nurse at the station. Captain Webb's readings are deteriorating, Katie said quietly. The trend started at 0800. His trachea is deviating. He's compensating with tachypnea. His chest pain complaints correlate with the respiratory change. The charge nurse glanced toward Hargrove's office, where the lights were still on at 1700 hours. The resident said he's stable. The resident is wrong. Katie's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. There was something underneath it now, something that had learned long ago how to say dangerous things in soft words. Tension pneumothorax presents with progressive tachypnea and tracheal deviation. O2 sat dropping, respiratory rate climbing. Classic presentation. The charge nurse looked back at Webb's room, then at Katie's face, seeing something there she didn't have a framework for. I'll mention it to the night resident. Katie already knew what would happen. The night resident would read a note from the day resident saying vitals were acceptable. The night resident would see a written warning on the board about an unauthorized nurse who didn't follow proper channels. The night resident would make his own assessment, find nothing obviously critical, and let the night pass. She clocked out at 1900 hours and drove home through Savannah traffic that moved like slow-motion rivers of metal and exhaustion. Mia was doing homework at the kitchen table when Katie arrived. 10 years old, with her father's dark hair and Katie's ability to read people like books. She looked up when Katie sat down across from her. "You're home early," Mia said. "Yes." Katie pulled the algebra worksheet across the table. "Let's check your work." They did homework together for 45 minutes, and Katie performed a version of normalcy that would have passed inspection in poor light. She made pasta for dinner. She asked about school. She helped Mia with a book report due Friday. When her daughter finally headed to bed, Katie stood in her doorway watching her sleep, the only person in the world who didn't know what Katie had done, what she'd been, what it cost to disappear into a life that was supposed to be safe. At 2230 hours, when the house was silent, Katie opened the hall closet. The combat boot sat on the highest shelf, tucked behind winter coats that hadn't been used in 2 seasons. Navy issue, size 7, the leather worn soft and scuffed from running across rooftops in Ramadi, from sand that never quite came out of the laces, from a firefight that lasted 43 minutes and ended with her carrying an 8-year-old boy who couldn't hear the explosions out of a collapsed building while the rest of her unit stayed behind to hold the door open. She ran her finger over the leather like reading Braille, like the boots could tell her whether she'd made the right choice, whether disappearing had been mercy or cowardice, whether this quiet life had been worth the price of becoming invisible. Her phone buzzed at 2247 hours. The message came from HR, * meeting requested with Dr. Hargrove and administration, 0800 tomorrow morning. * Katie closed the closet door, locked the boots away with the same care she'd learned to lock away every other part of herself, and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, waiting for morning to arrive. Morning arrived at 0600 with the kind of silence that comes before institutional machinery starts grinding. Dr. Hargrove sat in his office on the 8th floor, door closed, windows overlooking the Savannah River turning gold in the pre-dawn light. His desk held 3 coffee cups from the previous day, a leather desk pad monogrammed with his initials, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from 23 years of being right about everything that mattered. He picked up his phone and dialed. Gerald Hutchins answered on the second ring. The man owed Hargrove a favor from the prostate surgery 3 years ago, the kind of favor that never expired. "Gerald. It's Thomas. I need you to understand what we're dealing with at Mercy General." Hargrove's voice moved like a chess piece across a board he'd memorized. "One of my staff nurses is practicing outside her scope. Dangerous. Unqualified. Using some kind of unauthorized hand signals with a Navy patient instead of following protocol. I have documentation." He waited. The silence on the other end was agreement. "I'm bringing in outside auditors today. I wanted you to hear it from me first." We need to protect the hospital's accreditation. Another pause. Thank you, Gerald. I'll keep you informed. Hargrove hung up and immediately dialed again. This time, Marcus Chen from the board's credentialing committee. Then Patricia Walsh from administration. Each call was surgical in its precision. Each one planted the same seed: Katie Morrison was a liability. Katie Morrison was a risk. Katie Morrison needed to be evaluated. By 06:35, he'd made 5 calls. By 0700, he'd sent an email to every member of the peer review committee. Subject line: urgent, scope of practice violation and credential audit request. Attached was a copy of the break room incident report he'd filed himself, the observation about unauthorized communication methods, the notation about patient safety concerns. He'd written it carefully, using language that couldn't be challenged, just language precise enough to suggest something darker underneath. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, which cost more than most people's cars, and opened his laptop. He pulled up the credentialing files. Katie Morrison. Sparse wasn't the right word. Katie Morrison's employment history was like a redacted government document. 3 years at Walter Reed. 2 years at Naval Hospital San Diego. Then, nothing. A 8-year gap. Then civilian nursing at Mercy General for the past decade, each year documented and clean and utterly unremarkable. He made another call. This time to Harrison and Associates, a private credentialing investigation firm that specialized in credential verification for hospitals concerned about provider fitness. He'd used them twice before. They were thorough. They were discreet. They asked questions that made people nervous even when they had nothing to hide. I need a full background audit, Hargrove said. Former military employment with apparent gaps. Possible discrepancies in her licensing history. I need preliminary findings by end of business tomorrow. He gave them Katie's name, social security number, the dates of her naval service. And I need you to be very clear with anyone you contact that this is a confidential credentialing matter. We're not making accusations. We're just verifying. The investigator assured him it would be thorough. Hargrove knew it would be. He also knew that when investigators started asking questions about someone, the person being investigated never stayed invisible for long. Somewhere, someone would notice the inquiries. Someone would mention it to someone else. By the time Katie Morrison arrived at Mercy General at 0800, the machinery was already in motion. She came through the employee entrance at the West Wing, her badge clipped to her scrubs, her coffee in hand, her boots, the worn leather ones she'd carried out of Ramadi 20 years ago, moving through the corridors with the kind of practiced quiet that made her nearly invisible. She'd slept maybe 90 minutes. She'd checked Captain Webb's chart online at 0530. His O2 saturation had been 91. His respiratory rate was elevated. She headed to the ICU, the morning shift assignment sheet already pulled up on her phone. That's when she saw it, her name reassigned. Post-surgical floor. 0800 to 1600. Temporary staffing adjustment. Katie stopped walking. Her hand tightened around the coffee cup. The lobby around her moved with the usual morning noise, staff arriving, patients being wheeled toward imaging, overhead announcements about arriving ambulances, but she didn't hear any of it. She heard the words instead: temporary staffing adjustment. Not a request. Not a conversation. Not even the courtesy of a notification beforehand. She walked to the ICU anyway. The charge nurse looked up from her desk with the expression of someone who'd been instructed on what to say and rehearsed it exactly 3 times. Katie. Good morning. You're assigned to post-surgical today. I was assigned ICU. Katie's voice was level. Level wasn't the same as calm. Level was what happened when you'd learned to compress everything beneath the surface into a diamond-hard point. Dr. Hargrove requested a temporary adjustment. The charge nurse was young, maybe 30, with a kind of nervousness that suggested she'd already been warned about what would happen if she went against protocol. He said it was for staffing purposes. We had 2 call-outs. Katie glanced at the ICU board behind her. 3 nurses were assigned. The same 3 as yesterday. No call-outs. She could read this as clearly as she could read a chest X-ray. The reassignment wasn't about staffing. It was about access. It was about silencing her. I need to check on Captain Webb before I head to post-surgical. Katie, you're not assigned to that patient. The charge nurse's eyes finally met hers, and there was something like apology in them. Dr. Hargrove left specific orders. He said if you tried to access the patient's information or care, I should inform him immediately. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with their low electrical hum, the sound that became invisible after a while, the sound you only heard when you were paying attention to how the system was working against you. Katie turned without responding and walked toward the post-surgical floor. She knew what was happening. She'd watched it happen to other people, the ones who asked too many questions, the ones who pushed back on protocols that didn't make sense, the ones who represented a threat to the institutional hierarchy. First, you were moved. Then you were documented. Then you were isolated. By the time they terminated you, everyone already believed you were the problem. Hargrove had spent the last 18 hours building a case. And she was walking into the next chapter of it without a single way to defend herself with the truth. The post-surgical floor was quieter than the ICU, the patients recovering from scheduled procedures rather than fighting for their lives. Katie worked the morning with mechanical precision, checking vitals, adjusting pain medications, answering call lights, writing notes. Her hands moved through the routine correctly. Her mind was somewhere else. It was on the ICU monitor she'd glimpsed at 0800, Webb's oxygen saturation at 92% and his respiratory rate climbing. At 1100, she risked a walk toward the break room. It took her past the ICU. She could see Webb through the glass partition, sitting up in bed, his chest wrapped in bandages, his face tight with something between discomfort and panic. His eye scanned the room. A different nurse, someone she didn't recognize, was adjusting his full line. Webb was signing something. His hands were moving in the urgent, compressed way they moved when he was trying to communicate something critical. The nurse didn't look up. The nurse didn't know sign language. The nurse didn't see what Katie saw, which was the systematic failure of medical care dressed up as protocol. Katie turned away and continued walking. At 1400, she finished her shift on the post-surgical floor and walked back toward the parking lot. She moved past the ICU one more time, and this time Dr. Hargrove was standing at the nurse's station, reviewing charts with the precision of someone documenting everything for a record that would be used later. He looked up as she passed. "Nurse Morrison." His voice had the texture of polished brass. "Good shift." She stopped walking. She turned to face him. She could feel the weight of every minute of self-control she'd built over 20 years, every tactical decision she'd made to stay invisible, every choice to absorb the insult rather than fire back. She could feel all of it pressing against her chest like a physical thing. "Captain Webb is showing signs of respiratory compromise." Her voice was quiet. Quiet wasn't the same as weak. "His O2 saturation is dropping. His respiratory rate is elevated. He needs imaging and assessment." Hargrove's face didn't change. "Thank you for your concern. Captain Webb is under my direct care now. His medical management is not your responsibility. His life is everyone's responsibility. His life is under the care of the attending physician." Hargrove's smile was the kind of smile that predators show before they strike. Not under the care of staff members who've been reassigned to other units. Not under the care of people who think they can practice medicine by hand gestures and intuition. He turned back to the chart he'd been reviewing. "You have a good evening, Nurse Morrison." She left. Because staying meant giving him exactly what he wanted, the justification for the next escalation. Because the machinery was already in motion, and fighting it directly would only accelerate the process. Because she'd learned a long time ago that sometimes the only power you had was the power to disappear, and the only way to win was to make it impossible for the other person to catch you playing by their rules. She drove home through traffic that moved like congealed blood through arteries, each light red and endless, each intersection a delay in a system designed to frustrate anyone trying to move quickly through it. She sat at her kitchen table at 1900 and stared at her phone, at the app that would let her check Captain Webb's vital signs if she still had access to the ICU system. She didn't. Hargrove had removed that too. What they didn't know was that Katie Morrison had survived worse than administrative retaliation. She had survived Ramadi with a child's hand in hers and 17 seconds before the building came down. She had survived the debrief where they told her the operation never happened. She had survived 20 years of keeping secrets that could destroy her if they ever surfaced. But Captain Webb, who was lying in an ICU bed right now, unable to communicate, unable to tell anyone what his body was screaming, wasn't going to survive the same way. At 2000, her phone rang. Blocked number. She answered. Morrison. The voice was older, shaped by time and authority, the kind of voice that didn't need to explain who was speaking. It's Commander Price. Price's team from JSOC. We worked Ramadi together, 2004. I'm in Savannah. Heard you're at Mercy General. Heard there's trouble. Katie's breathing stopped for exactly 1 second. Then it resumed. Where are you? Ritz-Carlton. Downtown. I'm here for Webb ceremony next week. I can't surface you, Morrison. You know I can't. But I can listen. She told him everything. The reassignment. The documentation. The investigation. Hargrove's systematic dismantling of her access to the one patient she could actually help. She told him about Webb's dropping oxygen saturation and the nurse who didn't understand sign language and the attending physician who saw military medical expertise as a threat to his authority. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then, he's going to arrest overnight. You know he is. I know. And they won't let you near him. No. Then we need to be ready for what comes after that. Commander Price's voice had changed. It was no longer soft with discretion. It was sharp with the precision of someone preparing for an operation. You listening? Katie was listening. The phone rang at 0147. Katie was already asleep, the kind of sleep that comes from exhaustion rather than rest, her body collapsing into bed still wearing yesterday's scrubs. She jolted upright, muscle memory taking over. Hospital. Code. All hands. She was dressed in 5 minutes. The drive from her apartment to Mercy General took 12 minutes on empty streets. Savannah at 2 a.m. was a ghost town, humid air hanging over live oaks like a funeral shroud, traffic lights blinking yellow at intersections that saw no cars. She hit 67 miles per hour down Victory Drive, her hand steady on the wheel even though her mind was already 3 steps ahead, running through scenarios. Captain Webb. It had to be Webb. The security guard at the ER entrance almost turned her away. Your badge. I'm responding to the code. My suspension can wait 20 minutes. Her voice was flat. Not a question. He stepped aside. The ICU was chaos. Alarms screaming in overlapping frequencies, a sound like metal scraping metal, like something in the machinery of the building itself had come loose. Monitors beeping in counterpoint. The rhythmic whoosh of ventilators. Katie moved through it without hesitation, already scanning faces to find who needed her. The resident from yesterday stood outside Webb's room, pale and shaking, phone in hand. She didn't ask permission. She pushed past him. Captain Marcus Webb lay in bed his chest heaving against the gravity of his own failing lungs. His oxygen saturation read 78%, critical, dropping. His trachea was visibly deviated to the left, shifted like a railroad track bent by a derailment. His neck veins were distended, tight as cables under skin. Tension pneumothorax. A pocket of pressurized air collapsing his right lung, pushing his heart sideways, killing him one breath at a time. The on-call resident, a young man named Chen, stood frozen at the bedside, hands trembling. He needs a chest tube. I need to call the attending, we need OR clearance. His voice cracked like thin ice. He needs air in 90 seconds or he codes. Katie was already moving toward the crash cart, her hands reaching for the supplies before her mind had finished speaking the words aloud. Step aside. You can't. You're not. I'm going to. Not a request. A statement of fact. She tore open a 14-gauge angiocath needle, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had done this before, in a collapsed building in Ramadi, in the field hospital at FOB Shank, in the dark with incoming fire and a child's life depending on her getting it right the first time. She found the spot, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She could do this with her eyes closed. She plunged the needle into Webb's chest. The hiss of pressurized air escaping was like opening a champagne bottle, like releasing 20 years of pressure all at once. The sound filled the room and drowned out every other alarm. Katie held the catheter steady as the air rushed past the needle, equalizing the pressure in Webb's chest cavity, letting his lung expand again. She could feel the moment his body relaxed, the moment his cellular machinery started working again instead of suffocating. His oxygen saturation climbed. 81%. 84. 89. Call surgery now, Katie said, her voice low and steady. Tell them he needs a chest tube placed in OR. Tell them it's not optional. Chen fumbled for the phone, his fingers shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He dialed. His voice came out in broken pieces. Tension pneumothorax, decompressed at bedside, needs tube placement, who's on call? Webb's eyes opened. He looked directly at Katie, his pupils dilated and unfocused, trying to ground himself. His right hand moved, trembling, signing toward her, knew you'd come. Katie's hand signed back automatically, always. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. That was all the time they had. Then she stepped back, her heart rate climbing now that the immediate crisis had passed, her body flooding with adrenaline she no longer needed. The monitor showed a heart rate of 118, pressure normalizing, oxygen sat holding at 91% and climbing steadily. The room was silent except for the monitors. Katie became aware of eyes on her, nurses at the station looking through the glass wall, stunned. One of them was already on the phone, probably calling whoever was in charge. Whatever happened next was going to happen now. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 0237. 20 minutes later. Still in his home clothes, a polo shirt and khakis, his hair not yet styled, his face carrying the imprint of a pillow. He took one step into Webb's room and surveyed the scene like a general surveying a battlefield he hadn't authorized. His eyes found the needle. The catheter. Katie standing beside the crash cart with bloody gloves. Chen began explaining in a rush, the words tumbling over each other. His O2 was dropping, tracheal deviation, textbook tension pneumo, and she was the only one who. Nurse Morrison. Hargrove's voice cut through like a blade. Cold. Precise. You just performed a surgical procedure outside your scope of practice. That's a termination offense under hospital bylaws, not to mention potentially criminal. You're suspended, effective immediately. Badge and hospital ID. Now. Katie peeled off her gloves and stepped forward. Her hands unclipped her badge from her waistband and her ID card from her pocket. She placed them both in Hargrove's palm without a word. Her face showed nothing, no fear, no anger, no trembling. Just the mask of someone who had already survived worse. He would have died, she said quietly. That determination wasn't yours to make. Hargrove closed his hand around her credentials like he was closing a coffin. Security will escort you out. 2 security guards appeared in the doorway as if they'd been waiting behind the curtain. One was Daniel, an older man with kind eyes who'd always nodded to Katie in the halls. He looked uncomfortable, his jaw tight. He handed her a cardboard box, her locker belongings. A name tag. A half-eaten granola bar. Her watch, which she'd removed for the procedure. Her combat boots didn't fit in the box. Katie carried them under her arm as security walked her through the ICU. Other nurses looked away, their eyes sliding off her like she was invisible. The silence following her footsteps felt like a living thing. By the time she reached the main lobby, it was 0310. Captain Webb's wife was in the waiting room, her hand gripping the armrest of a chair, her eyes red. She stood when she saw Katie. "Nurse Morrison?" Her voice was fragile, confused. "Where are you going? Is he okay?" Katie couldn't explain. She couldn't tell the woman that she'd just saved her husband's life and gotten fired for it in the same moment. She couldn't explain the silence that came with a classified past and a Navy that had ordered her to disappear. She just shook her head, set the box down, and said, "He's stable. Take care of him," and walked out into the humid Savannah night, carrying boots that had walked through a city already half buried in rubble. At 0800, she was still in her scrubs, sitting at her kitchen table in the pale morning light, staring at nothing. The coffee in her mug had gone cold. The boots sat upright on the table like they were waiting for her to put them on and run somewhere. Anywhere. Mia came downstairs at 1500 for her after-school snack, still wearing her elementary school uniform, her backpack hanging from one shoulder. She stopped halfway to the kitchen. "Mom." Her voice was small. "Why are you home? What's wrong?" Katie looked at her daughter's face and felt something break open inside her chest. She pulled Mia into a hug without answering, her arms tight around the girl's shoulders, her face pressed into her daughter's hair. She couldn't find words. The words would require explaining something that couldn't be explained, not yet, maybe not ever. "I'm okay, baby," she whispered. "Just a hard day." But she wasn't okay. Mia pulled back and looked at her mom's face, studying it the way children do, looking for the truth underneath the lie. "You're crying." "I know." Katie let her hands drop. "Go do your homework. I'll make dinner." Mia went upstairs slowly, uncertain, her footsteps loud on the stairs. Katie sat back down at the table, her face in her hands, the weight of 20 years pressing down like a physical thing, the weight of silence, of names she couldn't say, of a unit buried so deep in classified files that officially they had never existed at all. The weight of a Navy order that said, "Disappear. Become nobody. Save lives in scrubs instead of combat boots, and never, ever mention what you really are." The boots on her table stared at her like an accusation. Outside, the afternoon heat pressed against the windows like something alive, and Katie Morrison sat alone with the wreckage of her life, unable to explain to her daughter why doing the right thing was destroying everything. But that wasn't the worst part. What she didn't know yet was that the universe was about to remember who she was. And it was going to remember her very loudly. The ER doors burst open at 0347 and the stretcher came through fast, gunshot wound to the abdomen, Syrian accent thick with panic, and the man on the gurney locked eyes with Katie the moment she stepped into the trauma bay. His hands gripped the stretcher rails and he started shouting in Arabic, then English, voice cracking, "You are the medic. Ramadi. You saved the children from our guns, the woman who could not be killed." Katie froze for exactly 1 second. The room went dead silent. Monitors beeped. Ventilators wheezed. And then Dr. Hargrove stepped forward to take the case, his hand already moving to push her aside, but Katie was faster. She didn't ask permission. She moved to the patient's head, hands steady as surgical lasers, and the refugee grabbed her wrist, 17 children. You pulled them from the rubble. You were covered in blood. You didn't die. Katie's voice dropped low, "I'm here now. You're going to live." Not a request. It was a command. The next voice they heard came from the hallway, a single sound, clear and deliberate, the thud of footsteps and the soft clink of something metal. Captain Webb appeared in the trauma bay doorway wearing his dress blues and his worn combat boots, the ones his family had brought from home the morning Katie fought to save his life. He wasn't supposed to be vertical. He shouldn't have been walking. But there he was, sinus rhythm holding steady on the monitor behind him, and his eyes locked onto Katie's face. He raised his hands and signed with precision, "Senior Chief." "That you?" Then he spoke aloud, his voice rough from the ventilator but unmistakable. "I know that face. I've known it for 20 years. Ramadi. You pulled me out of that collapsed building. You taught me signs so I wouldn't be alone." The room didn't just go quiet. The room held its breath. Staff members who'd treated Katie as invisible yesterday now watched her straighten, watched her sign back to Webb, "Welcome to the living, Captain." Her composure was absolute. No trembling. No shock. Just a woman stepping into a room she'd earned the right to occupy. That's when the Federal courier walked in, a young woman in a dark suit carrying a leather portfolio marked with JSOC clearances, the Joint Special Operations Command seal, black and red and impossible to ignore. She approached Katie directly, not Dr. Hargrove, not the charge nurse, and extended the portfolio, "Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison. These are yours." Katie opened it without looking away from Webb's face. The file inside was thick, official, stamped declassified, Operation Night Watch, dated 20 years prior, her photograph from her Navy days staring back at her, her rank printed in bold letters, "Senior Chief Petty Officer, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, operator status confirmed." The silence in the trauma bay was so thick you could operate in it. A nurse standing 3 feet away gasped. Another dropped her clipboard. The Syrian patient on the stretcher nodded slowly, understanding without language. This was the woman who'd haunted his memory. This was real. The elevator doors opened and Commander Price stepped out in dress uniform, gold insignia catching the fluorescent lights, his presence filling the corridor like a tank idling in a hangar. He was 6'2", shoulders built from 20 years of combat operations, and his eyes went straight to Katie. He saluted, a formal gesture, hand to temple, and spoke loud enough that staff gathering in the hallway could hear every word, "Senior Chief Morrison. I served with you. Task Force 121, Anbar Province, 2003 through 2006. He turned to address the gathered staff, his voice carrying the weight of command. "I'm here to tell you what this woman actually is. She holds 2 silver stars, one for pulling 15 civilians out of Ramadi under direct fire when her unit was engaged by insurgent forces. One for an operation that was classified until this morning. She holds 2 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in theater. She holds a Navy Commendation Medal. She holds the respect of every operator I've served with." With each medal, he paused. Let the words land. Let the audience understand that Katie Morrison wasn't a nurse playing hero. Katie Morrison was the hero everyone had overlooked for 2 decades. Dr. Hargrove stood frozen, his face draining of color as Price continued, "And she just saved Captain Webb's life while your chief of surgery was preparing termination paperwork. That's the woman you suspended for practicing outside her scope." The FBI agents arrived within minutes, 2 of them, federal credentials, serious faces that meant business. They moved with the efficient calm of people who'd done this before. The senior agent approached the hospital's CEO, Patricia Donovan, who'd come down from her office the moment she heard federal law enforcement had arrived. The agent's voice was professional, factual. "The classification on Operation Night Watch has been lifted due to a war crimes tribunal in The Hague. Senior Chief Morrison's service record is now part of the public record. Her medical interventions, her chain of command, her authority during combat operations, all of it is now declassified." He looked directly at Dr. Hargrove. "That means every decision she made at Mercy General, including the needle decompression she performed on Captain Webb, can now be reviewed in context of her actual qualifications, which are considerably more extensive than what your credentialing file suggests you even looked for." The agent's partner pulled out a folder. "Would like to speak with Dr. Hargrove in a conference room. Now, if you don't mind." The walk down the corridor took 45 seconds. Katie watched from the chaplain's office where she'd been asked to wait, sitting alone with her unsealed service record, finally able to read the mission parameters that had haunted her in silence for 2 decades. Through the glass door, she could see Hargrove being escorted to Conference Room B. She could hear the muted sound of voices behind that door, Donovan explaining his crimes with surgical precision, the agents documenting his retaliation, the weight of institutional failure landing on his shoulders like a collapsing building. 20 minutes later, the door opened. Hargrove emerged with the hollow eyes of a man whose power had just been surgically removed. He was escorted by Security Officer Daniel, who'd handed Katie her termination box yesterday morning. Daniel carried an identical box now. Hargrove's personal items. His photographs. His commendations. All of it being packed away like evidence. Daniel's voice was neutral but carried weight. "Dr. Hargrove, I believe you know the way out." The symmetry was exact. Perfect. The same words, the same box, the same humiliation he designed for Katie now wrapped around his own career. Hargrove walked past the unit board where Katie's write-up still hung. A nurse was removing it right then, replacing it with a formal commendation. His hand trembled as he held the box. Not restraint. Not composure. Just the uncontrolled shaking of a man watching his reputation evaporate in real time. He passed Captain Webb, who stood in the hallway in his dress blues and worn boots, and Webb raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. It wasn't a gesture of respect. It was a gesture of dismissal. Hargrove didn't salute back. He kept walking, the box pressed against his chest like a shield that wasn't protecting him anymore. 6 months later, the walls of Katie's office at the VA hospital in Savannah were lined with commendations and training certifications. Her lanyard read Director of Nursing, and the photo badge showed her in scrubs with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. She stood at her desk reviewing staffing reports when she paused, her eyes moving to the glass display case behind her monitor. 2 pairs of boots. Hers, size 7, scuffed from Ramadi sand that had worked its way into the laces and never completely came out. His, size 10, Captain Webb's childhood boots, the ones he'd asked his family to bring so he could stand in those wards and remember who'd saved him. Between them was a brass plaque. Some people never forget who saved them. Katie's hands moved across the keyboard, calm and precise, because this was the work she was actually meant to do. Healing. Training. Building a system where warriors didn't have to fight bureaucracy while fighting to survive. Across Savannah, at Savannah Community College in a classroom with fluorescent lights and peeling educational posters, Dr. Hargrove taught CPR to board students for $14 an hour. His medical license was under review. No hospital in the Southeast would return his calls. He demonstrated chest compressions on a mannequin with mechanical precision, his voice hollow, his presence diminished to the point where students barely looked at him. A kid in the back row asked, "Hey, didn't you used to be a surgeon or something?" Hargrove didn't answer. He finished the lesson and packed his bag alone, watching the students file out without a single thank you or goodbye. The silence in that classroom was the sound of a reputation becoming background noise. Katie sat at her kitchen table with Mia that evening, the same table where she'd cried in defeat 6 months earlier, where her daughter had found her broken at 3 in the afternoon. Now they shared dinner and conversation about school, about the new friends Mia had made, about a future that felt possible again. When Mia asked if her mom missed the hospital, Katie considered the question seriously. "I miss the patients. But I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She wasn't lying. She was finally at peace with both versions of herself, the one who'd disappeared into silence, and the one who'd finally spoken her truth. That night, sitting alone with tea and the glow of her laptop, Katie opened a blank document and began drafting a training program, communication protocols for medical staff working with veterans with hearing loss and PTSD. Page 1. Line 1. The work of building something better for the next person who'd been invisible. The final recognition came 3 months later at a hospital ceremony in Savannah. Katie stood on a stage accepting an award for veteran care innovation, and Captain Webb sat in the front row in dress uniform, now commanding a naval training unit, still wearing those same worn boots under his dress blues. When they asked her to speak, Katie stepped to the microphone and the room went completely still. Her voice carried the weight of 20 years of silence finally released. The hardest battles aren't always the ones we fight in war zones. Sometimes they're the ones we fight to hold on to who we are when the world tells us to disappear. Thank you for letting me serve again. Applause filled the room like thunder rolling across the city. Webb signed from his seat, "Hero." Katie signed back without hesitation, "Survivor." True class is what you do when the lights go out. She'd learned that in Ramadi. She'd proved it in Savannah. And she was finally allowed to say it out loud. If this story resonates with you, please subscribe to our channel for more stories about the quiet heroes who walk among us. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated and proved them wrong. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Let's talk about the warriors we don't see until it's too late.